I'd like to welcome our witnesses to the committee's 10th evidence session for our inquiry into the effects of artificial light and noise on human health. And in this session, we're now focusing on noise. So we are very pleased to welcome John Stewart, Chair of the UK Noise Association, and Lisa Lavia, Managing Director at the Noise Abatement Society. The session is being broadcast on Parliament Live TV, and a full transcript is being taken, which will be made available to you shortly after the session to make any minor corrections. And if you think of anything you wish you had said or any further evidence that would be useful to us, we'd be delighted to receive that as written evidence after this session. So let me kick off with the first question, if I may. And we'd like you each to briefly outline for the committee your work to date on the issue of noise pollution and why it's a concern, particularly in the context of human health. So if we could start with you, Lisa.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to provide oral evidence to the committee. I work for the Noise Abatement Society, and the Society is a charity that was founded in 1959, as I believe the committee heard a couple of days ago by my colleague from Quietmark, by John Connell, who lobbied the Noise Abatement Act through Parliament in 1960, making it UK's, I believe, first statutory noise regulation. Since then, there's been other iterations of noise law, but the Noise Abatement Act was one of the founding pieces of legislation. The Society is currently, our CEO is John Connell's daughter, Gloria Elliott, and I joined the Society in 2009. The work of the Society has always been very pragmatic. So rather than campaigning against things per se, the Society's viewpoint has always been how can the Society work with a wide group of stakeholders, including communities, to effect pragmatic solutions to noise pollution. The premise being that it's created by humans, so therefore we can find human solutions. It might not be easy, but it is possible. So the Society does its work. Its charitable remit is to find solutions to noise pollution problems for the public benefit. And the NAS is the only registered charity that's solely focused on noise pollution in the UK. So we're a small charity, and we tend to focus our work in a very targeted way on campaigns, research, and activity with policymakers and stakeholders to effect pragmatic solutions to critical problems that are maybe not easily solved elsewhere and where extensive work isn't already taking place. And that leads me on to one of the main things that I'll discuss in terms of our work during this committee, which I believe there might be a question on, is our work on soundscape. And the Society started working in the area of soundscape management as a solution to noise pollution problems in the UK in 2009. And since then, I've been a member of the ISO working group on developing standards on soundscape and the equivalent BSI committees, British Standards Institute. I'm also a member of the Institute of Acoustics, and I have an MBA. My background is in communications and stakeholder engagement for commercial business-to-business companies, and I've been working in the charitable sector, as I said, since 2009, and I'm currently conducting PhD research on soundscape engagement and planning.
Can you comment particularly, though, on the issue of noise pollution in the context of human health? Because that's what our inquiry is about.
Most certainly. It's impossible to solve noise pollution based on just the current conventional ways that noise is dealt with. Therefore, there is a need to have alternative ways to supplement the human perceptual response to sound, as the committee has heard something about in terms of non-acoustic factors. And that's where soundscape comes in, because the way people respond to sound is based on their perceptual reaction in context, which can create annoyance if it's something that they don't like or don't want to hear. And that is the indirect health pathway that triggers the sympathetic nervous system, creates stress responses. If that's prolonged, that then can lead to other sorts of extreme health conditions, as well as mental health conditions related to trauma and PTSD in relation to noise. And we see this played out extensively. I'm sure John will speak more about this as well. Just one example in terms of aviation is, while objectively equipment and planes might be getting quieter, human annoyance with aviation is going up. So there tends to be an inverse relationship between people's perception of sound, which if they don't like it, it's noise, and what we might be able to objectively measure even when things are quiet. So there's a direct link to having more positive, holistic solutions to solve noise problems, and that has a direct impact on individual and ultimately population-level health.
Thank you. John.
Yeah, thanks very much, and good morning to you all. We, at the UK Noise Association, we cover all aspects of noise, but I suppose the main concerns are neighbour noise, neighbourhood noise, traffic noise, and aircraft noise. The various studies show that's where most people get annoyed. I think what's interesting is this question of health, because I think we've been around about 20 years, just over 20 years, and I think noise and health has come up the agenda, and I think rightly so. And we may talk about it later, but I think the World Health Organization has played a large role in that. And their latest guidelines in 2018, they showed that people get annoyed by noise and therefore their health could be impacted at much lower levels than was recognized even 10 years ago. And I think this is almost the critical thing that for a long time, noise was seen either as a little bit quirky or was very loud, it would affect your health. I think what the World Health Organization and other bodies are now doing are saying that even at relatively low levels of noise, there can be health implications. And that, I think, is a big change over the last decade.
I suppose one of the things we're struggling a bit with both noise and light is the very clear scientific evidence that links the impacts to human health.
Yeah, I mean, there is some evidence, particularly some evidence done in the northern European countries, in the Netherlands and in Germany. What the World Health Organization in their 2018 guidelines, how they linked it was at a certain point a person would get annoyed, and when someone is annoyed, then that can lead to health. They're not quite saying, although they came very close to saying, that if you weren't annoyed, it couldn't affect your health. I mean, that's not quite right, and there are studies which show that not to be the case. But the key determinant of whether a noise could affect your health, as far as the World Health Organization was concerned, was annoyance. And what they, of course, found, as hinted just now, is that people are getting annoyed by noise at lower levels than previously accepted and recognized. And therefore, the health implications could be greater than previously recognized. But I think what needs to happen is further work to develop the thoughts of the World Health Organization.
Thank you. And we need to move on and to Lord Sharkey.
Yes, good morning. If we consider the UK's policy response to the problem of noise pollution, how well do you think we're currently tackling it? Perhaps we can use a scale here of 1 to 10. And do you think it's been given appropriate priority by the decision makers? Lisa, would you like to?
Yes. Again, as I think the committee may have heard from other witnesses, our view is 5 out of 10. And that's on the positive side. At a civil servant level, we have very good engagement, and I think a very good, a definite understanding, I think, at a civil servant level of the range of issues related to noise and health, and especially in the case that I'm emphasizing, the perceptual response, which is an indirect health trigger that we have more limited evidence on, but nonetheless is extremely important, and that evidence base is growing. And the issue, why on the negative side, why I only give it a 5, is that at a ministerial and a whole of government approach, we have seen almost even a de-emphasis on noise. And I think it was noted by IOA colleagues that the noise policy statement for England, which we would have considered, well, we welcomed it. We felt it certainly could have gone further in perhaps its prescription of what it expected government departments to do. But even that seems somewhat de-emphasized with the headline that it now has, saying that it was brought in under the last a different government. So that sends a very mixed message. And again, as you've just heard regarding light, with the 25-year environment plan, with no mention of noise, I mean, that just makes it very confusing. What emphasis does the government place on noise at all? But more importantly, the problem is that it also sets a tone whereby it appears that government isn't keeping pace with the change in evidence and innovation that is happening and how we measure and assess noise. To the point that John made, the World Health Organization pointed out that, and this is well acknowledged by noise researchers, that only about a third of the human response is related to objective levels, yet most of noise in the built environment is dealt with based on objective levels. Thereby, the industry is operating with an acknowledged 70% error rate. That 70% is made up of about a third of so-called non-acoustic factors, many of which have been identified, personal, social, tangible factors, and then others that the World Health Organization euphemistically refers to as other factors. Whatever they might be, we might also say they're all non-acoustic factors to some extent, but the point is, to research all of those factors together is what's necessary to come up with better evidence and more holistic solutions. But what's required to do that, to Lord Chair's point, and one of the reasons why we have very limited evidence at this stage, is it requires a transdisciplinary research program to develop that evidence. By that I mean the engineering sciences, which currently do a lot with noise, some of the health sciences, which also do that, but also humanities and social science protocols that need to be mixed together to come up with new protocols and new ways of assessing indicators and saliency and being able to provide the evidence that's required for such a committee as this. But we are at the very beginning stages of even an acknowledgement of that. I think Professor Clark pointed out that this was starting with things like oral diversity and soundscape, but these are at the very early stages. Nonetheless, they're critical, they're necessary, and they are beginning to happen. And with a lack of a strategic emphasis on this at a government level, where's the incentive for businesses and researchers and industry to begin to participate in this?
Thank you. John.
Yes, I think I would go a little bit lower than Lisa. I would go to maybe 3 out of 10. I agree with an awful lot of what Lisa has just said. I think there are perhaps two main reasons, as far as I can see, why noise has been, I think I liked your word, de-emphasized. One is that other pollutants have been seen as more important. And I think particularly over the last 5 or 10 years, climate change has gone up the agenda. Now, climate change is clearly an issue, but I think what has happened with government, perhaps also with the wider environmental movement, is that they have emphasized climate change to virtually the exclusion of everything else. And I think that needs to be addressed, because there can be noise consequences, as we may find out a little bit later when we talk about energy, of some of the solutions to climate change. So I think that's one. Air pollution has also gone up the agenda, and rightly so. And as both those have gone up the agenda, noise has gone down the agenda. Now, I think my second point, and perhaps the reason why government is less inclined to prioritize noise, is because noise is seen as an individual problem. Noise is often seen as a local problem. If you've got people concerned about climate change, as we saw this last weekend, you can get hundreds of thousands of people on the streets concerned about a collective problem. Now, you rarely get that with noise. You do in certain particular circumstances, if certain areas are affected or will be affected by noise. The third runway at Heathrow is probably quite a good example of that. But largely, noise is an individual problem. And so it's much easier, I think, for governments and to some extent local authorities to marginalize and de-emphasize noise because they don't have the same collective pressure on them as they do with some of the other pollutants. And just to add to that, it's not only an individual problem. Noise, not exclusively, but often, predominantly, is affecting lower-income households. The stats are quite clear, particularly as far as neighbour noise is concerned. And those are the people less likely to make their voice heard within the system. So I think it's de-emphasised, and other pollutants are emphasised more, but there are reasons for that, and I've tried to outline some of them.
Okay, thank you. Do you think that the noise policy statement actually is it useful at the moment? Does it need changing or updating?
At the time that it was being drafted, NAS was consulted informally, and we fed into the drafters then that we felt that this statement needed to include more future-looking elements, including soundscape, because the work on the ISO soundscape standards was just beginning. And there was already a reasonable evidence base about the importance of soundscape and these more holistic ways of measuring noise to take into account that 70%. So we said, why not put something more explicit in the NPSE? We did not win that debate. But we do support that it links itself with UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we're glad that it's there, but we would certainly like to see it modernized and updated. And in our view, and I declare an interest, we've consulted with the Welsh Government on recent updating of their noise and soundscape technical advice note, which went from just focusing on noise to noise, air quality, and soundscape, harmonizing those pieces of legislation together. And the technical advice note, which we participated in the drafting of, is, I would say this, wouldn't I, what we consider an exemplar. And it's not just based on our recommendations. The Welsh Government decided that it was important to link a more holistic approach to noise. And so from a positive perspective, we would say it's great that that example exists, and that has been widely consulted on, so it's not just our opinion. But we really feel that it's time that the noise policy statement for England takes that a similarly wider and holistic outcomes-based approach that takes into account these areas of non-acoustic factors. So it sets an expectation for industry and researchers to then begin to pull together more transdisciplinary evidence base to support development.
Thank you. John, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I mean, I think it was good, and indeed it was groundbreaking at the time. And the civil servants within DEFRA did a tremendous job, and they also did a tremendous job in trying to make it relevant and to other government departments, and for other government departments to take it on board when formulating their policy. So it was a good thing. It is very brief, it is very short, it is very general. I think it does need to as Lisa says, be more holistic, but it also needs to have a little bit more detail. I don't mean, I'm not looking for a 24-page detailed document, but it does need a little bit more than the few sentences we've got right now.
Could I ask you both very quickly? I think you both said that we need more research, although the research base is insufficient as it stands at the moment. What more do we need, and in what specific areas would more research be most useful?
Very specifically, and it might be a long list, but if I had one item to call for, it is a overt focus on transdisciplinary noise research. At the moment, most noise research is led by engineering and or health colleagues. Extremely important, those are. It's very important. What is lacking is transdisciplinarity across the health and engineering disciplines, and then including social science and humanities disciplines. And it's the nexus of those disciplines coming together that is required to be able to get the type of evidence that can help us illuminate and elucidate on the indicators that are salient in certain types of contexts that can help us to address these non-acoustic factors and the perceptual aspects of people's response to sound, and triangulated with the objective evidence of which there is a large base both in the engineering and health community.
Yes, I think that's probably right. I would add two things to that, well, maybe three things. First of all, I think there is a lot of research there already on noise, and we may come on to this a little bit later on, but I think some of it is governments can say, let's have more research, as an excuse for not really doing very much. Mm-hmm. Now, I think there's a lot of research there, and some part of me says, just get on with it. Just get on with implementing policies to reduce noise. I think in addition to what Lisa said, there are two areas where we probably do need more research, and they are the new upcoming areas in new energy and in drones and light aircraft. We've called for a noise audit of all new energy sources, so of wind, nuclear, heat pumps, solar. They're new, but have they really been researched properly as far as noise is concerned? We don't think so. And the other area, which is drones and light aircraft coming in, because there's a danger that they will come in before the research has been done and before the regulation is in place.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Lord Chair.
Thank you. Lord Krebs.
Thank you, Lord Chair. My question follows neatly from your last comment, John. You said, although there are areas where we need more research, we've got enough evidence to get on with practical action. And so I'd like both of you, perhaps starting with you, John, to say what your priorities are for practical action to reduce noise pollution, are there significant easy wins where noise pollution could be curtailed if it was given sufficient priority?
Yes, I think there are. I think, as I said at the beginning, I think the two areas which most affect people are traffic noise and neighbourhood noise. So I'll kind of deal with them because I think there are possible solutions. In fact, there was a study done some years ago in the Netherlands which said that traffic noise could be reduced by about 70%. Without really needing to have to deal with the volume of traffic. Clearly, if you reduce the volume of traffic, you can reduce noise. But there are other things that can be done, and can be done quite quickly. The main thing as far as noise is concerned is lower speed limits or enforcement of current speed limits. There is a very clear correlation between noise and speed. And that may be politically difficult at times, but actually in technical terms, that is not difficult at all. That could be potentially a quick win. The second one that could be a relatively quick win is the introduction of what's called porous asphalt, that's low noise surfaces on roads. And what we would like to see is the government, any government, have a rolling program where you start with where the roads are noisiest or perhaps where they have the most impact on people and slowly introduce, as repairs are taking place, quiet road surfaces. That could considerably reduce the impact on noise. The other thing, of course, that's coming in is electric cars. Now, electric cars will be quiet up to a certain level. They will reduce noise a lot until cars get to about 35 miles per hour. After that, it's tyre noise which takes over, so therefore they won't be so effective. I think that is something that's coming in, but those would be my three things, that lower speed limits, quieter road surfaces, electric cars coming in, and you haven't eliminated noise, but you've significantly reduced it in areas where people live. On neighbour noise, I think it is a question of enforcement. The laws tend to be there. The laws have been introduced over the last 20, 30 years. They're not being enforced properly, partly because of a lack of resources for local authorities. Although, truth be known, it was always some local authorities were never very keen on enforcing them, even when they had the resources. It was a bit of a postcode lottery. But certainly enforcement of neighbour noise laws would help considerably. Plus, and this would be longer term, plus sound insulation of properties. And we would like to see a programme of sound insulation accompanying thermal insulation of properties, so you deal with both noise and warmth at the same time. Now, that is expensive, but what we would say is that can't be done overnight, but start in the areas where noise is at its worst. Local authorities know where they are because they have to do noise maps, which they produce every few years. Start with the properties which are experiencing worse noise and move along. So things can be done. Some of them are quick wins, some of them are a bit longer.
Before turning to Lisa for her view, can I just pick up on the transport point? You talked extensively about roads. What about rail? I mean, coming into London, as I do regularly, you go past either coming into Paddington or Marylebone, and I'm sure it's the same for other main stations. You go past miles and miles of houses and flats very close to railway lines, and that must be dreadful in terms of noise.
It can be. I mean, particularly if you're experiencing freight noise, because freight trains, it's not just the noise, but it's the vibration.
Yes.
And they're often there at night, and that is a problem which is going to be difficult to tackle. When it comes to passenger trains, there are technical ways of improving the rail and improving the wheels of the trains, which can reduce the noise quite considerably. And in that case, it's really just a question of political will. But when it comes to freight trains and the vibration, is going to be difficult. And I think with freight, we really need to look at the operational hours of freight, because I'm not sure how much can be done in technical terms to reduce the noise of the trains.
What about speed limits on freight?
Yes, speed limits would improve, would help no end. And I think what we've always called for is lower speed limits where communities will be impacted. So if a train is out in the countryside and is not really impacting anybody, then it can move more quickly. But certainly lower speed limits would in built-up areas would help considerably, and of course could be done relatively painlessly.
Thank you very much. Lisa, is there anything you'd like to add briefly?
Yes, just on the last point regarding railway noise. The committee may also already be aware of the RSSB, Rail Safety Standards Board. They have a noise working group that's been, and we're a member of that, that's been sitting for some time. And, pardon me, and they are looking very closely at advice that can be taken and given on how to practically reduce noise and have a much more holistic approach. So it may be, I mean, I'm happy to send through some links, but it could be to refer back to them and get some of the information that they've been producing. And to John's point, to solve some of these problems, the other thing I would add regarding rail noise is the announcements. Yep. So poor acoustics in rail stations are very difficult for travelers, and they can be, the solution oftentimes has been just to make them louder, which can really affect surrounding communities very badly. And also the train horns. The technology of the train horns is ear-splittingly loud, and again, extremely upsetting to local communities if they have to hear those. They can be very alarming if you're a passenger standing on the side on a platform when one of those is going by and you're not prepared for it. I mean, they're a danger for people with hearing difficulties or perhaps on the autistic spectrum. Those sorts of loud, sharp noises are just extremely dangerous, in fact. So that's the other thing I would say in relation to train noise. In relation to quick wins, the approach that the NAS has taken is, in one sense, this is like trying to plug the side of a hole, side of a boat that's I guess for lack of a better term, sinking. You plug the hole, but the boat is still going down, because as long as we are only assessing or trying to deal with noise pollution based on levels and only or primarily noise at source, it's like it's one leg of a three-legged stool. Like I said, you're dealing with one aspect, but you've got these two other aspects, the human perceptual response and the contextual relevance of that response, plus all the other objective and subjective indicators that we already know about that significantly impact that 70% of the human response that are not being dealt with. So despite the best efforts of the engineering community to deal with noise at source, which we applaud, there needs to be a balanced approach, because without that, I don't think we're going to make significant headway. And the problem with that is that good money gets spent on reducing noise at source, and people are still complaining, there's still problems. And that's a result of a lack of a holistic, coordinated response to solving the problem. So our one quick win is require soundscape design and plans in relation to every aspect of the built environment. And that could be, let's say, just added to the noise policy statement for England, for instance. It doesn't have to go into the level of depth that the Welsh Government has gone into. Fortunately, those documents could be there to refer to if anybody's looking. But what that would do is it would set an overt expectation for developers, planners, and local authorities to feel covered, if you will, in taking action. When we talk to stakeholders, they're aware that these new ways of doing things exist, but where's the incentive when they go into a bidding process? You come in with a novel approach, and all of a sudden it looks very silly against somebody who's just dealing with noise control. And how does a local authority assess that? How do they get the support, if you will, to get experts to help them assess that? And we already know, amongst the UK acoustics community, I believe you heard from Arup, there's the Association of Noise Consultants. I'm on a committee of theirs, a soundscape working group, where they're looking to develop an industry-based response to how they transpose soundscape standards into their planning and design regulations. But even they say, as we can see the opportunity and the need and the opportunity for innovation and advancement in solving problems for our clients, for communities, but if we go in with a plan like this at the moment, nobody knows how to assess it, and again, we look way too expensive and like we're gold plating our proposals. So just having an expectation of soundscape planning and management, either a yes or no. If it's not going to be done, it is just a noise control problem that's determined to fix it, then fine. But in most cases, we know it's not just a noise control issue. Therefore, let's incentivize all stakeholders, including communities, to be able to come together and work holistically on solving some problems very practically at a local level, like John said, and that will help the UK to build more of a corpus of practical-based evidence. And the one other thing I would add is for the Noise Abatement Society ourselves, we run an award for in the 22nd years now. We've run the John Connell Awards. We've given about 300 awards, mostly organizations and individuals in the UK, including John, I believe, received an award, and indeed Arup Sound Lab, which you heard about, where we have awarded practical, innovative, unfortunately novel solutions that shouldn't be novel, that deal with and based on their holistic approach to solving noise. So in one sense, for almost any problem that can be put up, we know of a John Connell Award winner that has gone that extra mile and taken a holistic approach to solve a problem. So we know it's possible, and we believe that the opportunity cost of not doing that for the UK is large, not just on human health, but also innovation and development.
Can I remind our witnesses we do need short, succinct answers to questions, or we won't get through all of the questions in this session. And if you don't mind, I'll move on to Lord Holmes at that point.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning to you both. Thank you for being with us this morning. Can I ask, do you think there are significant gaps in the current regulatory framework for dealing with noise pollution, or is it a lack of resource around enforcement which makes the problem difficult to tackle? If I could start with you, Lisa.
Just very briefly, I think that the main issue holding back better solutions is the strategic policy framework that sets the expectation for action to be taken in a more individualized case-by-case basis. So that's what we think is the main thing that's missing.
Very much. John?
Yes, very quickly. I mean, I think it's largely a lack of resources and enforcement. I think there are one or two areas where there does need to be a better regulatory framework. First of all, on wind turbine noise, the guidelines, which are called the ETSU guidelines, are rather outdated because they don't really cover the really large turbines that are going in, and that needs to be looked at again. And as I said earlier on, I think there does need to be a new and innovative regulatory framework for some of the sustainable energy measures which are coming in, as well as the drones and the flying taxis.
Do you have a sense that the government departments that should are gripping this, or is there a sense that it's across too many, it's falling between the cracks? John?
Yes, I think there is. I think that's a big problem because there are just so many departments who have got a finger in the noise pie, and as it were. And my feeling is we need some overall. I mean, there was a question, I think, earlier in the last session from Lord Winston about whether there should be a czar for quiet sky, for quiet and clear skies. We've long thought there should be a noise czar, because what a noise czar would do is not just bring everything together, but would actually raise the profile of noise, put a little pressure on government and local authorities to look at it more seriously and to refer to your point, in a more coordinated way.
Thank you both very much.
Thank you, Lord Holmes, for being so quick. Viscount Hamworth.
Yes, Lisa Lavia has talked of soundscapes, and could she explain to us the concept of a soundscape? I observe that we're talking of a soundscape, not a noisescape. But perhaps we might begin by anatomizing the concept of noise. I mean, can you define noise in terms of its spectral decomposition, in terms of a spectrum of sounds? What is noise as distinct from sounds?
Well,
it's not simply the intensity of sound, is it?
Yeah, so from a physical engineering perspective, and I'm not an engineer, so but from a physics perspective, the term really is sound. And noise is a perceptual construct. So noise is unwanted sound, but the physical aspect of acoustic waves is sound waves. That's what and that's really what, in a sense, we should always refer to. But we're way downstream of the terms being used interchangeably and synonymously, which is incorrect. Soundscape, as defined by the international standards, is defined as the human perceptual response to sound in context, and therefore it separates the human perceptual response from the acoustic environment, which is made up of a collection of sounds. And in the human perceptual response, the response may be, I like that sound, therefore I'm very happy about it, glad to experience it, or it may be I don't like it, or I don't like it at this particular time and place, and therefore it's noise, and that noise reaction triggers annoyance, which then triggers the stress reactions in the body.
So it could be very subjective. I mean, different people have different reactions to various sounds. So how, in that case, can you define a soundscape unequivocally? I mean, presumably you can't define a standard that applies to all people. Yeah,
well, the standard has 4 parts, 3 of which have been published, and they are British standards as well. And the 4th is under development. And the standard is a transdisciplinary standard that it's based on a premise put forward by Murray Schafer, Canadian polymath and composer who led the soundscape movement from the 70s. And Schafer talks about the need everything in the environment has an acoustic signature. So from that basis, he said that noise pollution isn't inevitable, it's a lack of soundscape management, just like litter. We have litter on the ground. Well, somebody's taken action to do that rather than put it somewhere else. So we end up with noise pollution because we're not starting with a strategic, holistic management of the acoustic environment that's intentional, like we would say for a music hall. There's a very intentional design that goes into that because there's an acknowledgement that the acoustic environment is very important. That doesn't extend, unfortunately, to the built environment, but Schaefer's premise is that it should. And Schaefer's thesis is that to do that effectively requires a cooperation between what he referred to as science, society, and the arts, what I've been referring to as science, engineering and health sciences, objective sciences, society, communities, humanities, social sciences, and the arts, let's say design-based disciplines like architecture. And it's the nexus of those coming together in parity that allow for the design of something that's effective in context.
John, can you make a contribution to our enlightenment? Sorry.
Probably not as good a one as Lisa's just made, but I'll try. I think this. I think the point you made is interesting, and it's. And in some ways, it's also problematic to getting a solution. Is that different people hear noise in different ways, and let me take an example around Heathrow Airport. People who've lived under the flight path, a young man who I spoke to went to school under the flight path, a mile from the airport. Noise is not a problem. He's grown up with it. Somebody living 18 miles under the flight path, the noise is much less and it's driving them crazy. And so the individual reaction to noise is determined by a whole range of factors. And I think that's why it also, as I say, makes noise actually quite difficult to deal with, because different people respond in different ways. It also, unfortunately, let the authorities off the hook a bit, because they will say, oh, somebody is super sensitive to noise. Now, there may be some people who are super sensitive to noise, but it doesn't mean to say that their problem shouldn't be addressed. So I think you've hit the nail on the head, that different people reacting to noise in different ways really makes finding a solution and persuading the authorities to implement a solution much harder.
Sound is a signal, and the signal may mean very different things to different people. But
that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
How complicated it is.
Yes.
Can I ask a quick question? Could a soundscape approach actually make somewhere noisier, because irritation is the difference between the level of one noise and another? I'm still struggling a bit with this soundscape concept.
The soundscape concept, and I'll be happy to send some further information on this. I know that I understand, because I'm part of the IOA committee, I believe Lord Way has asked for further information, so I've contributed to that, but I can send some other things. This 70%, these what we call non-acoustic factors, the only reason soundscape seems difficult and somewhat opaque in relation to noise pollution is because most of the work to determine what constitutes a soundscape and how to measure and assess it has been done in research communities thus far. There's very little practical work. However, that's beginning to filter through. So this 70%, these other factors are measurable and accessible because many of the principles are based in psychology and social science and mental health sciences, because non-acoustic factors relate to people's perception, how they're feeling. There could be certain triggers. There could be medical triggers, mental health triggers, emotional triggers. So we have a base of knowledge across other disciplines. And this is why I keep referring to the transdisciplinarity that's required to be able to integrate that knowledge into triangulating with objective noise measurements. In addition to just decibel measurements, though, we have to consider other characteristics of a sound wave, sharpness, roughness, tonality. All of those things are hardly ever addressed in noise control, so those account too. So it's possible to measure a soundscape response. We just don't do it very often, except in laboratory, but it is possible, and ways of doing that are advancing. In relation to how that is applicable now, there is a protocol within the soundscape standards for assessing a community's response in relation to a development or proposal. And then from those responses that use social surveys and psychology-based tools to do perceptual assessments of what people are thinking about in terms of the development, then that can be applied to a triangulation process along with objective measurements of the sound environment, and then an assessment of that to give a recommendation. And that's what the soundscape standards set out. And that, just to, again, not to completely refer back to it, but that's detailed in the Welsh Government's technical advice note on how that could be applied in a context-based approach. From that perspective, it makes noise management much more akin to processes that are already used in landscape planning, biodiversity planning, which are already multi- and transdisciplinary in their approach. So it's difficult if we look at things how they have been done in the past, but if we look at changing the way we assess noise in the built environment and bring in other disciplines to modernize our approach to it, it's actually quite, it's easy to map out, perhaps not easy to do in practice because it's not done, but it is being done. Most of the large consultancies in the UK have soundscape experts and are already doing this on certain projects, and there are some exemplars that have done incredible work.
It would be very interesting to have from you some examples where this has actually been done in practice,
yes,
and the evidence of I don't know how it's measured, but the evidence of how this has made a difference. I don't know, since you don't have a baseline, it's kind of hard to know, but it would be interesting for us to see that, I think.
May I just very briefly in terms of baseline, and I'll put this in writing as well, is the baseline is there a community agreement around a development? Again, we must think of it more in terms of how something is being designed. Let's say a kitchen. There are certain things that are required, but the actual design and how it's done might vary widely. So, okay.
Thank you. Can we move on to Lord Borwick?
Thank you very much. What are the major barriers to implementing better public policy on noise pollution in the UK? And are there other countries that do this more effectively? And am I right that the top barrier is the lack of clear medical research showing an adverse effect on human health?
Yeah, I mean, okay, I'll give you a rest for a second, Lisa. Yes, I mean, the northern European countries are really quite hot on noise, and they tend to be way ahead of the rest of Europe and perhaps the rest of the world. Germany, Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands. Not only do they have very tight noise regulations, they actually enforce them. And some of the things we were talking about earlier, you know, is it enforcement that's lacking? Go to Germany, go to the Netherlands, go to some of the Scandinavian countries, and it's very clear that a lot of it is the lack of enforcement. So there are areas. I'm glad to say that we can copy, and you know that would give particularly local authorities confidence that it actually can be done. Your other question was on. Just remind me.
On medical research.
Ah, yes, the medical research. Well, it's getting better. It's getting better. I mean, the World Health Organization has done quite a lot of work on this. Again, there's a fair bit of work done in Germany and the Netherlands. My feeling is that there's always need for more medical research, because we can always discover more about the impacts of anything on our bodies. But my feeling is that we've probably got enough medical research to get on with implementing some practical policies on noise. Because my real fear, as I said earlier on, is that the authorities will hold back and say, well, we haven't quite got all the definitive research. That's probably true. But they probably don't need all the definitive research actually to do much more than they're doing right now.
I would add, and starting with the medical research, what's needed, and I believe Professor Clark referred to this as well, is more research. Well, there's more research on objective health, but in terms of subjective health, mental health, and the indirect health pathway triggered by annoyance. There is much more research needed on that. And I believe Professor Clark referred to that's beginning, but we're still at the early stages. That is very important to have more research on the sympathetic nervous system and those subjective and psychological aspects of noise response in order to have a more holistic assessment of overall health. So if we take overall health as physical health as well as well-being, and which leads to a sense of quality of life, it's important to have much more research on the indirect health pathways of noise. So that's very critical, and that will go some way to helping to demystify these subjective responses and how that would fit in a soundscape assessment per se. And in terms of regulation, we would just like to see, again, an expectation and an emphasis across all government departments that this is done. And at the moment, we're not seeing that. In certain departments, they may be doing something, a targeted issue around noise pollution, but they're not incorporating these other subjective elements and setting a standard, if you will, to call forth exemplar projects that could begin to test these things in situ.
Okay. There are certain pollutants, air pollution, smoking, asbestos, which is absolutely clear from the medical research that it is really bad for human health. And the government has definitely done work to reduce the effect of those pollutants. There doesn't seem to be that same research on noise that it says it is absolutely clear, double-blind, peer-reviewed research that shows that it is bad for human health and therefore should be given the equal priority to those other pollutants of which we know.
Well,
am I wrong in that analysis?
Well, with respect, I do believe so. The World Health Organization has published 2 burden of disease from noise pollution, primarily only on the objective health impacts of noise. So the noise and health community are very clear that there is a link between noise and health through the stress responses related to noise and how that magnifies or increases or sometimes has a direct relation to objective health. The indirect pathway of annoyance, which triggers, again, the sympathetic nervous system, whereby people can be in a high state of continued stress for a long time, absolutely contributes to negative health effects. And this is because in the human mind, noise is first of all classified based on fight or flight. The mind, at a very subconscious level, tries to make sense of a sound. And if that sound is unwanted or disliked or not welcomed at that time, the mind is very objective. It just goes, starts ringing the bell. Tell me what to do with this. And if that isn't dealt with effectively through many forms of ways it could be dealt with, then the mind continues to send those stress signals because something's wrong. So it's really important to understand that, because living in a high state of stress, of course, there's well-documented medical evidence on the impact on human health. With the other pollutants, the impacts are able to be assessed objectively, which makes it much more straightforward to build a very consistent, harmonized evidence base. Again, as I've been saying, that's not the case with noise because of the human perceptual response that accounts for 70% of the issues that currently are under-researched. So it's not that the evidence isn't there, it's that the evidence isn't harmonized in a way because it's far more complex than other environmental pollutants.
Yeah, I don't need anything, I'm fine. Yeah.
The two, just briefly, the two examples, John, that you gave earlier of the child who'd grown up in the noise, who was not affected by noise, and somebody who lived 18 miles away, I think you said, who was affected by noise. Presumably you would expect that the effect on their health of that noise would be different between the two people.
I think that's right, and I think that's what the World Health Organization is saying, is that when someone is annoyed by noise. It's the annoyance which leads to stress. So it's the person who's 18 miles away is more likely to suffer ill health effects, ironically, than the person who's almost living on top of Heathrow Airport. And is this link between annoyance and health, which seems to be crucial as far as the World Health Organization is concerned. But also, I think, as you said in your opening remarks, makes it more difficult than air pollution or others, because you've got this annoyance factor coming in and being almost a trigger to bad health. And you don't have that kind of intermediate factor with air pollution and some of the other pollutants. So it is a more complex business.
I understand.
Thank you. Lord Way.
Yes, I'm very conscious that we're at the very end, so if you need to respond to some of this in writing at length, I do have one question, but wanted to take the liberty to ask something I wanted to ask earlier, which is really around the fact that, as you mentioned, annoyance. Is there scope, given many, for example, younger people are using sort of technologies such as noise cancellation, headphones, earbuds, and of course there are other noise cancellation technologies in the environment. Is there scope to harness that, and could that change future policy regulations so that people can, at an individual level, cut out noise when it's sort of at its peak, rather than having to kind of work out what to put in a wider environment? And then building on that, what are the key take-home recommendations that you think government should adopt to improve policy in this area?
Yes, briefly, and I'll also reply in writing as well. Yes, there's a range, just as with any psychological or mental health challenge, there are a range of ways to address the problem depending on the problem identification and analysis. Non-acoustic factors have many dimensions. Sometimes they're physical. There might be objectively medical related. Certain medications can cause hypersensitivity to noise. There could be personality traits. There could be just situational aspects of the built environment. If something's happening that's noisier outside than it used to be, or I'm working from home more and so I notice things. One of the keys is education, so that people can understand, if you will, how to self-prescribe, and first of all, understand what's happening to them, rather than those annoyance responses building up, which can then be exasperated over time and lead to trauma-based and PTSD-type responses in the extreme. So it is important, just as with other mental health challenges or issues, for people to understand how to self-prescribe, but also know when to get, help, extra help if they need it. So there's a range of potential responses, one of which is absolutely, just wearing earplugs in certain environments if that's what's needed, or playing some background water sounds or what have you. It's not the only response, but it certainly targets one aspect of what can be done. And so we would call for, one of the things we would like to see as well is a form of education about sound starting from early years. We have a program called Love Your Ears where we try to address this, but also due to resources on a very small scale at this stage. But the principle is that rather than just potentially people learning about acoustics if they choose to through physics, they learn about acoustics from the non-acoustic factors, elements. And so maybe a module, let's say in social emotional learning, where people begin to understand that these things happen and how they can be affected, how they affect others, and perhaps more positive ways to deal with it. And that would go some way to helping to educate not just young people, but also people as they get older, so that they could perhaps participate in a more collaborative way around noise discussions, because they will understand more innately what's happening on this subconscious level and how that can exasperate coming to effective solutions.
Very quickly, because I think we're running out of time, I will address the second part of your question. What things would we like from government? I think three general things in particular. First of all, ensure that existing legislation, of which there is a fair bit, is properly implemented. Secondly, government needs to come to an evidence-based position on new technology, and particularly the new technology surrounding energy developments. And thirdly, to put noise on a par with other pollutants.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to take my opportunity as chair, John, to ask you a very quick question, which is when you talked about the easy wins and in terms of road noise, you talked about low noise road surfaces.
Yes.
You didn't talk about barriers along the sides of motorways.
I didn't talk about barriers. It's interesting. I'd written barriers down as my fourth point here. Barriers, I think, work. Barriers are expensive. I think that's the problem with barriers. So our view on barriers is, yes, they have a role to play, but in very specific circumstances, and probably where noise is particularly loud. So motorways, as you say, is the best example. I think with motorway, if you go to Germany, if you go to the Netherlands, you see many more noise barriers, and they need to go in because it can improve those people's lives considerably, but it will be at a bit of a cost.
Right. Thank you. That was useful to have that clarification. So thank you very much, both of you, for what's been an interesting session. And we will now conclude this morning's evidence sessions. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.